The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., and the silence at Mercy General Hospital was almost palpable. The cold fluorescent light in the hallway illuminated the white, sterile walls as I, Sarah, walked through the psychiatric ward corridors. This night shift always had a peculiar atmosphere, a kind of unsettling calm that seeped into your bones, especially when the city was asleep and the world seemed suspended in time. I had only been working at the hospital for a few months, but I quickly realized that the night shift had its quirks. At first, I thought it was just accumulated fatigue, but in the past few weeks, something deeper and more disturbing began to reveal itself. I felt I wasn't alone, even when the hallway was empty. It was as if shadows hovered at the edge of my vision, too quick to catch, but present enough to send a chill down my spine. As I made my rounds, checking on patients in rooms 314 to 320, I noticed that Mr. Grant, a quiet elderly man, was awake. He was sitting on the bed, staring at some random spot on the ceiling. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Approaching him, I asked in a low voice so as not to wake the other patients. "Mr. Grant, is everything all right? Do you need anything?" He didn't answer immediately, just continued to move his lips as if having a silent conversation with the void. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and as I turned to reach for the clipboard by the bed, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the air around me was saturated with an ethereal sound. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clearly desperate. At first, I thought it was Mr. Grant, but when I looked back at him, his eyes were now fixed on mine. His mouth was still moving, but the sounds I heard didn't match the movement of his lips. My heart began to race, and a sense of panic started to grow in the back of my mind. I needed to get out of there, needed a moment to catch my breath. I mumbled something about coming back soon and hurried out of the room, feeling Mr. Grant's eyes following me down the hallway. The lights, which had previously seemed merely cold and sterile, now felt much more intense, as if reality around me had become distorted. I walked to the small break room where we always kept coffee ready, hoping to find some comfort in a hot cup. As I filled my cup, my mind tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was the fatigue, maybe the accumulated tension, maybe. But then, again, the whisper. This time, clearer and closer. I dropped the cup, which shattered on the floor, spilling hot coffee everywhere. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound, but there was no one. Just the shadows of chairs and the table, lightly dancing under the lamp's light. The room was empty, or at least it seemed to be. I knew I needed to pull myself together. My job required focus and calm, especially in that ward. But how could I ignore the growing feeling that something was deeply wrong? What had once been just a vague unease was turning into palpable fear. I wasn't just tired, I was terrified. Then I heard footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, but definitely footsteps, coming from the corridor just beyond the break room. I rushed to the door, peeking out to see who else was awake at that hour. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched intensified, as if dozens of invisible eyes were fixed on me. I returned to my workstation, trying to ignore the feeling that something or someone was following me. The hospital's silence, which I had once found comforting, now felt oppressive, suffocating. I sat at the computer and began recording the night's observations, trying to distract my mind. Then, in the middle of the quiet, the phone rang, breaking the silence with a piercing sound that made me jump in my chair. I answered immediately, my heart still racing. "Sarah?" It was Carla's voice, another nurse who was also on duty that night. Her voice sounded tense, almost breathless. "Hi, Carla. Is everything all right? Did you hear that?" My throat went dry. "What?" The whispers in the hallway. Her voice trembled, and I realized she was as scared as I was. "It's not just me, is it? You heard them too, didn't you?" I swallowed hard, trying to control the tremor in my voice. Yes, I heard them." For a moment, there was a terrifying silence on the other end of the line. When Carla finally spoke again, her voice was a trembling whisper. "I think something is here with us." And at that moment, at the end of the hallway, I saw the shadow. Tall, thin, with a distorted shape that wasn't entirely human. It moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor before I could be sure of what I had seen. But I knew, deep down, that something was there, watching, waiting. I hung up the phone, my trembling fingers still clutching the receiver. The terror was starting to overwhelm me, but at the same time, a morbid curiosity began to grow. What was happening at Mercy General? What were those whispers? And why did it feel like with each passing night, the presence was getting stronger, closer? I didn't know, but something told me that if I wanted to survive, I needed to find out. And fast. The night shift had only just begun. The next night, I returned to work with a heavy heart. With each step I took towards Mercy General, a growing sense of dread took root in me. It was hard to ignore the chills that ran down my spine as I remembered the whispers and the shadow I had seen. But what disturbed me most was Carla's disappearance. When I arrived at the hospital, the first thing I did was ask about her. No one knew where she was. Her absence was recorded as a no-show. But what I knew, what I felt, was that something much worse had happened. I remembered that her shift had ended normally, but she never left the hospital. It was as if she had been swallowed by those shadows that crawled through the corridors. My shift began with the usual routine, but with an added weight. Each step felt heavier, each sound more threatening. The psychiatric ward was especially quiet, a silence that seemed to vibrate with hidden tension. It was as if all the patients knew something was wrong, but were trapped in their minds, unable to express what they felt. I passed by Mr. Grant's room, but he was no longer there. His bed was empty, the sheets meticulously folded. I checked the chart and found that he had died the previous morning. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. But something about it didn't seem right. He seemed so calm, so absorbed in something the last time I saw him. The image of his lips moving silently haunted me, and I felt a pang of guilt for not doing more. Was he trying to tell me something? Something that could have saved him? I continued the rounds, but each room I passed seemed emptier, more desolate. It was as if the ward was slowly dying, as if an invisible presence was draining the life from the place. I tried to keep my mind occupied with mundane tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then it happened again. The whispers started, but this time they weren't just distant echoes. They seemed to come directly from beside me, as if someone was whispering in my ear. I spun around quickly, expecting to see someone, anything, but the corridor was empty. The tension inside me was growing like a tight knot, and then something called out to me. A distinct sound amidst the whispers, a voice. Not a human voice, but something distorted, like a muffled scream trying to emerge from the bottom of a well. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The voice led me to the lower floor, an area of the hospital rarely used. It was where we kept old files and out-of-use medical equipment. I had been there a few times before, but each step I took that night made the place feel more distant from the real world, as if I were crossing a veil that separated sanity from something much darker. I reached the end of a long corridor where a rusty steel door awaited. I didn't remember this door, and there was no reason for it to be there. It was ajar, a narrow opening through which a faint light escaped. I felt my heart race, adrenaline pumping through my veins as curiosity and fear battled for control. I pushed the door open, which creaked with a metallic groan. Inside, the air was thick, saturated with a smell that mixed mold, dust, and something else, something I couldn't identify, but that sent a shiver of repulsion down my spine. The room was small, its walls covered with old files, folders stacked on shelves that seemed ready to collapse. But it wasn't the room's state that caught my attention. In the center of the room, an old, worn leather stretcher was positioned under a dim light that flickered occasionally. Next to the stretcher, a pedestal held a large book with a black cover and yellowed, time-worn pages. The letters on the cover were faded, almost unreadable, but I managed to make out the word ritual. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. As I approached the book, I noticed that the pages were filled with ancient writing, symbols I didn't recognize, but that exuded an aura of malevolence. As I flipped through the pages, something caught my attention, a photograph tucked between two sheets. The photo was faded, but it clearly showed a group of people, doctors and nurses, standing next to a stretcher. But it wasn't an ordinary stretcher. It was the same one that stood in the center of the room. And the people, something was wrong with their faces, blurred, distorted as if the image itself was rebelling against being seen. A name was scrawled on the back of the photo, Blackwell Asylum, 1910. The asylum. A wave of horror washed over me as I realized. Mercy General wasn't just a hospital. It was built on the bones of a place of pain, suffering, and cruelty. And I knew that whatever was causing these things wasn't just a presence, but a dark legacy of something that should never have been forgotten. I clenched the photograph tightly, feeling the paper crinkle under my fingers. I was about to put the photo away when I heard a sound behind me, like the slow shuffle of bare feet on the floor. Panic froze me for a moment, but I forced myself to turn around. There, standing in the doorway, was a patient I recognized. It was John, a middle-aged man admitted with severe schizophrenia, but he didn't seem like himself. His eyes were glazed, vacant, and his skin pale, as if all life had been drained from him. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice rough and raspy. "They are coming for you." Before I could react, he disappeared into the darkness of the corridor, leaving only the echo of his words. I ran to the door, trying to follow him, but the corridor was once again empty. No sign of John, no clue that anyone had been there. I returned to the room, the panic now a constant scream in my mind. I closed the book, pocketed the photo in my lab coat, and left, locking the door behind me. Something was about to happen, something I couldn't understand, but that terrified me deeply. I knew I needed to learn more about the asylum, about what really happened back then, and how it was all connected to Mercy General. But what scared me more was the feeling that, with each passing night, the shadows grew bolder, the whispers clearer, and that soon, very soon, I would be swallowed by them. The night shift was far from over, and the darkness seemed denser than ever. The muffled sound of the clock echoed through the walls of Mercy General as I prepared for another long night. It was clear to me that there was something terribly wrong with the hospital, and the events of the past few nights had only reinforced that certainty. I couldn't shake the image of John, his vacant eyes, and that terrifying message. With the photograph of Blackwell Asylum still in my lab coat pocket, I decided it was time to investigate further. I needed to understand what was happening and, above all, how to escape this spiral of horror before it was too late. But fear pulsed within me, mixed with a strange determination to uncover the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. The hospital was, as always, quiet during the night shift, but now the silence had a different quality. It was dense, heavy, as if it was waiting for something. There was no doubt that the patients felt it too. They were more agitated, more restless, and I knew it wasn't just because of their health conditions. I took the elevator to the basement, where the old files were kept. If Mercy General was really built on top of the old Blackwell Asylum, there would be records, some clue as to what had happened there. The elevator descended slowly, each floor passing with a mechanical sound that seemed louder than usual, and for a moment, I had the impression that something was following me. The doors opened with a creak, revealing a long, dimly lit corridor. The feeling of déjà vu was intense, as if I had walked this path before. Perhaps it was the memory of the previous night, or something deeper, like a memory trapped somewhere beyond my consciousness. The files were organized on shelves that seemed ready to give way under the weight of time. I ran my fingers over the worn labels until I found the section for old documents. There, among dusty folders, I found one labeled Blackwell Asylum. My fingers trembled as I pulled the folder from the shelf, the old, cracked leather making a dry sound as it opened. Inside, there were patient records, medical reports, and most disturbingly, a diary. The yellowed pages were filled with handwritten notes, dated from 1909 to 1911. The name on the first page made my stomach turn. Dr. Henry Whitaker, the asylum's director at the time. I began reading the entries, each more disturbing than the last. Dr. Whitaker wrote about experiments conducted on patients, cruel practices that he justified as scientific advances in understanding mental illness. But soon the tone of the reports changed. He began to talk about visions, about voices that whispered to him, guiding him to rituals that promised miraculous cures but were actually something much more sinister. One entry in particular caught my attention. October 29, 1910. The patients have been responsive to the ritual. The voices assure me that we are on the right path. The shadows have blessed us with their power. Complete healing is possible, but it requires sacrifice. The asylum is prepared. The deaths are necessary. There is no other way. They will come to claim what is theirs, and we will be ready. What others call madness, I call progress. One must embrace the unknown to achieve true understanding. The words from the diary pulsed in my mind. Sacrifices? Cures through rituals? This wasn't medicine. It was something profoundly wrong, evil. I closed the diary forcefully, feeling the oppression in the air increase. I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the corridor, a tall, distorted figure was standing, its outline blurred by the shadows. The same shadow I had seen before, which seemed to grow and take on a more distinct form each time. It didn't move, it just watched me, and I felt there was no way to escape. It was as if the hospital corridors had closed in around me, trapping me there with that terrifying presence. I clutched the diary tightly, my fingers digging into the cover. I needed to stay lucid. I needed to think. I took a deep breath and took a step back, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure, which began to slowly move toward me, like a tide of darkness advancing. Desperation settled in my chest, and the only thing I could do was run. I ran down the corridor, hearing the figure's footsteps echoing right behind me. With each beat of my heart, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until finally I could understand their words. You shouldn't be here. You will see what we did, what we will do again. I reached the elevator, the doors already closing, and in a desperate act, I threw myself inside. The doors closed with a snap, and I repeatedly pressed the ground floor button, feeling the tears start to stream down my face. The seconds felt eternal, but finally, the elevator began to rise, taking me away from that terrible presence. When the doors opened, I ran to the break room, where I locked myself in, trying to catch my breath. The diary was still in my hands, like an anchor tying me to that distorted reality. I needed help, but who would believe me? Who could face something so old and powerful? Then I remembered a name, Dr. Elias Morton, one of the hospital's oldest psychiatrists, known for his interest in history and his theories about paranormal phenomena. He was always seen as eccentric, but now, his theories might be my only hope. Holding the diary, I left the room and headed for Morton's office, feeling that each step brought me closer to a truth I wasn't prepared to face. But I knew I had no choice. Something was waking up at Mercy General, something ancient and vengeful. And if I didn't figure out how to stop it, I knew I would be the next victim. When I finally reached the office, I knocked on the door urgently. It opened slowly, revealing Dr. Morton, his tired eyes evaluating me with curiosity. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked, his calm voice contrasting with the panic in my eyes. I couldn't speak. I just handed him the diary. He took it, flipping through the pages carefully, and as he read, his face grew darker. "Oh my God," he murmured. "This is worse than I thought. We need to act quickly before it's too late." With those words, I knew that the last night at Mercy General was just beginning, and that the shadows hiding in the darkest corners of the hospital were about to reveal their true face. Dr. Morton's office was a cave of accumulated knowledge, with piles of books, ancient manuscripts, and strange artifacts covering every available surface. A faint light illuminated the room, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. He closed the diary carefully and placed it on the desk before turning to me, his eyes fixed on mine, filled with a gravity that made me shudder. "Sarah, do you have any idea what you found?" he asked, his voice low, as if worried that something or someone might hear him. I shook my head, still trembling. I don't know. All I know is that something terrible is happening at the hospital. The shadows, the whispers, Mr. Grant's death, Carla's disappearance. It's all connected, isn't it? Dr. Morton sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Unfortunately, yes. What you found in Dr. Whitaker's diary is part of a very old and dark secret that Mercy General carries. Those rituals, The terrible practices he describes, they weren't just the delusions of a madman. There's something real and very dangerous in this. He stood up, grabbing a thick, dusty book from a shelf. The title was in Latin, but I didn't need to understand the words to feel the threat emanating from it. Dr. Morton opened it to a marked page, showing a hand-drawn symbol, the same symbol I had seen in Whitaker's diary. This symbol, he said, pointing to the drawing, is an ancient sigil associated with invocations that transcend our common understanding. These rituals were conducted with the intent of channeling forces beyond our reality, forces that should not be disturbed. I approached, feeling a morbid curiosity mixed with terror. But why? What were they hoping to achieve? Morton looked at me with an expression of weariness and sadness. Power, healing, eternal life, perhaps. But at what cost? What Whitaker and the others at Blackwell Asylum didn't realize, or refused to accept, is that these forces demand a price. And now, after all this time, they want what was promised to them. A shiver ran through my body. And what does that mean for us? For the hospital? It means, he replied slowly, that the barriers between our world and the other side are weakening. And every death, every disappearance, only strengthens these forces. If we don't do something to stop this cycle, the consequences will be devastating. As he spoke, I felt a change in the atmosphere. The air became heavy, charged with an almost palpable electricity. The lights in the office began to flicker, and I knew we didn't have much time. What can we do? I asked, trying to stay calm. Dr. Morton picked up the diary again, flipping to a specific page. There is a mention of a banishment ritual, something that might be able to stop what has been started. But it won't be easy. We need to find the place where it all began, where the first sacrifice was made. And we have to do it before the dark forces fully manifest. His words made me remember the room where I had found the photograph, the old stretcher, the ritualistic book. I knew that was the place. I think I know where it is, I said, feeling my stomach turn at the thought of going back there. He nodded. Then we can't waste time. Let's go. We left the office in silence, each step echoing in the empty corridor. The hospital was bathed in a supernatural silence, the quiet almost unbearable. The way to the basement felt longer than before, as if the walls themselves were moving, trying to divert us from our goal. When we finally reached that rusty steel door, terror gripped my heart. Dr. Morton, with a resolute expression, opened the door firmly. The room was just as I remembered, but now there was something more, a tangible presence that made the air vibrate erratically. I approached the stretcher, where the ritualistic book was still open, and felt the shadows move around us, as if they were watching us, waiting. Dr. Morton began tracing symbols on the floor around the stretcher, muttering words in an ancient language that I couldn't understand. The shadows seemed to gain form, humanoid figures moving at the edges of the faint light. I felt their presence, sentinels of an ancient horror, ready to strike if we made a single mistake. My heart pounded in my chest as Morton finished drawing the last symbol. He turned to me, his face marked by effort and fear. Now, Sarah, we need an object that belongs to those who started the ritual. Something that carries their energy. He looked at the diary in his hands. I think this will do. He placed the diary in the center of the symbols, on the stretcher, and began reciting the banishment words with more intensity. The air around us seemed to writhe, the shadows vibrating as if trying to break through the barriers of the ritual. Suddenly, A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing all the lights except the one illuminating the stretcher. The dark figures around us began to advance, their distorted faces revealing glowing eyes and mouths that opened in macabre smiles. Morton continued chanting the words, his voice growing in power as the shadows came closer and closer. Panic seized me, but I forced myself to stay calm. We had to resist. We had to. And then everything stopped. The shadows froze. The light over the stretcher pulsed once, twice, and then exploded in a bright flash. I was thrown back by the impact, hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of me. The room was now in complete silence. The shadows dissipated, the malevolent presence gone. Dr. Morton was on his knees, exhausted, but alive. The diary was on fire, burning with a strange flame that didn't seem natural, but didn't produce any heat. We watched in silence as the book disintegrated, reduced to ashes. When the last page was consumed, we knew it was over. The air felt lighter, the hospital quieter, but this time it was a silence that brought relief, not terror. I approached Morton, helping him to his feet. Did we do it? Is it over? He nodded, with a tired but relieved look. For now, yes. But these forces, they never disappear completely. The important thing is that we did what we could. The cycle was interrupted. We left the room in silence, climbing back to the surface, where the morning light began to invade the corridors. The hospital felt different, as if a heavy cloud had been lifted. But the sense of loss was still there. The patients, my missing colleague, and the souls who had suffered so much under the weight of ancient and cruel rituals. As I left Mercy General for the last time, I knew that something in me had changed forever. The world, in some way, seemed vaster and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I had survived the night shift, but what I had experienced would haunt me forever. The shadows had retreated, but I knew they were never truly far away, and that, somewhere, they were waiting for a new opportunity to cross over into our world. But that morning, at least, the sun was shining once again. Before we go to the next stories, subscribe to the channel for more horror stories and creepypastas like this one. Second story, The Unknown Patient. My name is Rachel, and I never imagined that my first job as a nurse would lead to such a disturbing experience. Freshly graduated, full of enthusiasm and dreams, I landed a position in the emergency department of an old, dilapidated hospital in New Orleans. The place had a certain aura of mystery, with its peeling walls and narrow corridors that seemed never to see the light of day. But somehow, it attracted me. It was as if the hospital had stories to tell, and I was eager to hear them. That night, my shift began like any other. Patients coming and going, cries of pain, and the constant sound of machines monitoring vital signs. I was in the middle of a routine procedure when one of the doctors, Dr. Blake, called me urgently. "Rachel, we need you in room 3. A strange case just arrived." I hurried down the corridor, my heart beating faster than usual. When I entered the room, I saw the patient lying on the stretcher, completely still. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he had no identification. He had been found unconscious in a local cemetery, according to the report the doctor handed me. "We have no idea who he is," said Dr. Blake, visibly uncomfortable. I approached the patient, observing him closely. He was covered in dirt and leaves, as if he had spent days buried. Suddenly, he started murmuring something, but the words made no sense. It was as if he were speaking in an ancient language, something I had never heard before. "We need to stabilize him," said Dr. Blake, but there was hesitation in his voice. As we tried to care for the man, the lights in the room began to flicker. I thought it was just an electrical fault, but then I realized that the monitors around him were also malfunctioning. The atmosphere in the room became heavy, oppressive, as if something invisible was watching us. "This isn't right," I murmured to myself, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. Dr. Blake decided to sedate the patient to keep him calm, but when the needle pierced his skin, his eyes suddenly opened, fixing on me. I'll never forget that look, empty, but full of deep darkness. He whispered something that sounded like a name, but the word was shrouded in an accent I couldn't identify. Then he passed out again. With my heart still racing, I left the room to find more information about the patient. No one knew anything about him. Not even the police had any leads. What was even stranger was that since his arrival, other bizarre events had started to occur. The lights in the hospital flickered constantly, and some equipment, which had always worked perfectly, began to fail inexplicably. As I returned to the ward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. There was something different about that man, and it wasn't just his physical condition. There was a presence, an energy that seemed to follow my every move, even outside his room. Little did I know that this would be just the first of many nights where terror would begin to manifest, little by little, taking over the hospital and eventually myself. I woke up the next morning with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The memories of the previous night were still fresh in my mind, but I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. After all, it was an old hospital, prone to electrical faults and infrastructure problems. Even so, something deep inside me insisted that there was more to it all. When I returned to work that night, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed even more oppressive. The corridors, always silent, now seemed to echo with distant whispers, as if the walls held secrets that should never be revealed. Some of my colleagues also seemed tense, exchanging worried looks and speaking in hushed tones. I went straight to room 3, where the unknown patient was. As I entered, I noticed he was agitated, though still unconscious. His hands moved slightly, as if trying to grasp something in the air. The heart monitor showed an irregular rhythm, fluctuating between fast and slow beats. And then, again, he began to murmur in that ancient language, words that seemed to form an incantation, a sort of profane prayer. Curious and scared, I approached him, trying to decipher what he was saying. But the words seemed to dance in the air, incomprehensible yet laden with a force that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to record the murmurs with my cell phone, hoping that someone could help decipher the mystery. During my shift, the heavy atmosphere continued to intensify. The equipment failures became more frequent, and I heard reports from other staff about lights flickering and doors closing on their own. One of the nurses, James, confided in me that he felt like he was being watched constantly since the patient's arrival. "It's like something is surrounding us, Rachel. Like something wants to trap us here," he said with a haunted look. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was a storm of doubts and fears. And then, something happened that left me completely terrified. It was near midnight when I decided to check on the patient again. As I entered the room, I saw that he was sitting up on the stretcher, his eyes wide and fixed on me. His mouth was moving rapidly, but no sound came from his lips. It was like an echo, a voice that seemed to come from elsewhere, a voice that didn't belong to him. I froze, unable to move. He raised his hand, pointing directly at me, and in that moment, I felt an intense cold sweep through my body, as if death itself had passed through me. The air around me seemed to vibrate, and then I heard the sound, a low, drawn-out scream, coming from the walls, the shadows, everywhere at once. I backed away, almost stumbling, and ran out of the room. In the corridor, panic began to take hold of me. The lights were flickering furiously, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw shadows moving at the edges of my vision, indistinct figures that seemed to be watching me. I ran to the doctor's room, where I found Dr. Blake. I was out of my mind, trying to explain what had just happened, but he seemed skeptical, though visibly shaken. "Rachel, it must be the stress. This is all very strange, but we need to stay calm," he said, trying to reassure me, though his hands trembled slightly. But something inside me knew that what was happening was much more than just stress or coincidences. There was something evil in that patient, something ancient and powerful that was beginning to awaken. And I was caught in the middle of it all, not knowing how or why, but with the growing sense that my role in this was more important than I could imagine. And it was at that moment, as I sat down to try to take a deep breath and calm my nerves, that a terrible idea crossed my mind. What if the patient wasn't the victim, but the catalyst? What if he had been brought to the hospital not to be saved, but to condemn us? After what happened in room 3, my mind was a mess of fear and doubts. But there was something I knew I had to do. Understand what was happening. The hospital was becoming a living nightmare, and I couldn't just ignore the signs. I needed to find answers, and quickly. At the beginning of my next shift, I decided to visit the hospital library. It was an old and dusty place, rarely frequented by any of the staff. The tall shelves were full of old medical books, patient files, and a myriad of documents that seemed untouched for decades. If there was any clue about what was happening with the unknown patient, I hoped to find it there. I began to sift through the oldest files, looking for any mention of similar cases. It didn't take long before I found something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a folder, yellowed with age, with the name Case 1942 written in faded letters. When I opened it, I found reports about a patient who had been admitted to the hospital under very similar circumstances to my current patient. He had also been found unconscious in a local cemetery, and the doctors at the time reported strange events after his arrival. As I read, my blood ran cold. The 1942 patient had been found murmuring in an ancient and incomprehensible language, just like the man in room 3. The report described that the events in the hospital began to worsen over time. Constant blackouts, unexplained noises, and a growing sense of oppression that affected everyone who came into contact with the patient. What was most disturbing, however, was the conclusion of the report. After weeks of unsuccessful attempts to treat the patient, he mysteriously disappeared. There was no explanation for his disappearance, and the case was closed as inconclusive. But the document included a handwritten note made by one of the doctors at the time. He is not human. He cannot be cured. The evil is in him, but it is also in what surrounds him, a cycle that never ends. The last sentence made my heart race. If he returns, the hospital is doomed. I closed the file with trembling hands, trying to process what I had read. It was clear that what was happening now was not the first time this evil had manifested here. The patient was part of something much bigger, something that transcended the boundaries of time and human understanding. With the file in hand, I ran to the doctor's room, where I found Dr. Blake and other staff members. I needed to warn them about what I had discovered. "This is no coincidence, doctor." I began out of breath. "The patient, this has happened before in 1942, and the records say he's not human. Something much worse is happening." Dr. Blake looked at me with an incredulous expression, but there was also fear in his eyes. "Rachel, are you suggesting this is some kind of curse?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I don't know what it is," I replied, my voice trembling, "but the hospital is in danger. We're all in danger. We need to do something before it's too late." There was a heavy silence in the room. Everyone knew that something strange was happening, but accepting the idea that we were dealing with something supernatural was difficult. However, the growing tension in the hospital and the inexplicable events that continued to occur made it impossible to ignore the truth. Then Dr. Blake suggested something that chilled me to the bone. What if we transfer him to another place, to a specialized psychiatric unit? My mind raced. What if the transfer was exactly what this evil wanted? What if moving the patient only spread the curse, instead of containing it? But before I could express my concerns, a piercing scream echoed through the corridors. We all turned at the same time, recognizing the sound as coming from room 3. We ran there, hearts pounding, and what we found left me speechless. The patient was standing out of bed, with his arms stretched towards the ceiling. His eyes were completely black, with no trace of humanity, and the words coming out of his mouth were no longer mere whispers now, but a deep, guttural voice that reverberated through the walls. It was as if the hospital itself was being pulled into the depths of hell. "He's awakening," I whispered, terror taking hold of me. "We can't let him leave this place. If he gets out, we're all doomed." What I didn't know was that the true horror was yet to come, and that the fate of all of us was about to be sealed. I knew that night would be different from all the others. The hospital, which had once been just a decaying and dark place, now seemed to be breathing. Every wall, every corridor seemed to pulse with malignant energy. The patient's words, that strange language he murmured, echoed in my mind like a sinister song I couldn't shake. Dr. Blake and the other doctors were in a panic. We didn't know what to do. All transfer plans had been abandoned, as it was clear that moving the patient would only spread the evil that was trapped here. But then, a horrible idea began to form in my mind. What if the only way to stop this was to confront it directly, face the evil, and try to break the curse somehow? I took a deep breath and mentally prepared for what was to come. I didn't know what to do, but I felt that somehow fate had placed me at the center of this nightmare for a reason. I couldn't run away. With a determined look, I returned to room 3, where the patient was still standing, arms raised, and eyes black as the void. The doctors had retreated, not knowing how to deal with it. The air in the room was heavy, almost impossible to breathe, and a sense of impending despair filled every inch of that space. "Rachel, what are you doing?" I heard Dr. Blake ask behind me, but I ignored him. Something inside me said that I was the only one who could stop this. I grabbed my cell phone and started playing the recording I made of the patient's whispers the night before. To my surprise, he immediately reacted, his black eyes focusing on me, and the deep voice inside him stopped for a moment, as if listening. "Can you hear me?" I asked, my voice trembling but trying to stay calm. "What do you want?" He didn't respond with words, but instead began to advance towards me, his eyes still locked on mine. I could feel the cold intensifying as he approached, a sensation that penetrated my bones and froze my blood. But I didn't back down. "I know what you are," I said, though my voice was faltering. "You don't belong in this world. You're here to spread evil, but I won't let you." The words came out of me without my planning them, as if I was being guided by a force beyond my understanding. But at that moment, the patient stopped advancing and began to tremble, as if he were fighting against something inside himself. Then I realized that the name he had whispered on the first night, that name I couldn't understand, was the key. It was the name of some ancient force, some being that possessed this body and was using it as a door to enter our world. Desperate, I began repeating the name, trying to pronounce it as close as possible to what I had heard. Each time I said it, the patient trembled more, as if he were being pushed back by an invisible force. "Get out of this place," I shouted, the courage swelling in my chest as I continued to repeat the name. "Go back to where you belong." The patient let out an agonizing scream, a sound that seemed composed of 1,000 voices, each more desperate than the last. The lights in the room exploded, plunging us into total darkness. But I kept repeating the name, my voice now hoarse and filled with a fury I didn't even know I possessed. Suddenly, everything went silent. The scream stopped, and the cold that had taken over the room began to dissipate slowly. When the emergency lights came on, I saw that the patient was lying on the floor, motionless. His eyes, now normal, were closed, and he seemed finally at peace. I knelt beside him, trying to find some sign of life. But there was nothing. He was gone, and along with him, the feeling of oppression and evil that had enveloped the hospital had also disappeared. Everything was quiet, as if the place had finally been freed from an ancient burden. Dr. Blake and the other doctors slowly approached, still dazed by what had just happened. Is it over?" Dr. Blake asked, disbelief evident in his voice. I just nodded, still speechless, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. I knew I would never forget that night, and that the scars from that event would stay with me forever. But I also knew that somehow I had made a difference. The cycle had been broken, at least for now. That night, as I left the hospital, the wind blew gently, and for the first time since I had started working there, I felt true peace. I looked up at the starry sky of New Orleans, and although I knew that evil always finds a way to return, I was certain that the hospital and everyone there was safe, at least until another forgotten name, murmured in an ancient whisper, was spoken again.